to the second meeting of the CVTA Finance Committee. Everyone is staying dry. And we will kick our meeting off with a couple of instructions from Plan RVA, correct? Martha?
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. My name is Martha Heater. I'm the Executive Director here at Plan RVA. We are hosting our very first meeting since our office closed in March, so appreciate your patience with us this morning. Just wanted to orient you a little bit. I know many of you have been in the room before, but we've changed the layout a little bit to provide for physical distancing. So I did just want to call out your attention. This is an exit door. This is not. So if you need to exit, please go through this door, the door you came in, and the 3 doors along this side. Those are all exits, but they do go into the interior of our office. If you need to get out of the building, please use the exterior doors if they're closest to you. The restrooms, as you may know, are down the hall, probably past them when you walked in. And if you need anything, please let myself or Mark Bittner know. We're supporting kind of the logistics behind the scenes today. Wi-Fi passwords are on cards along the room if you need to get online. And this meeting is being streamed via YouTube. So it will be available for members of the public to view and or for you to view later. Anything else? If you haven't signed in, please do so. It's back by the door that you entered. So thank you very much.
Any questions? Seeing none, move on to the first item of our agenda is approval of the CVTA Finance Committee agenda. I'll ask for a motion to approve the Finance Committee agenda that is presented.
So moved.
Second. Do you have something, Chad?
Mr. Chair, we need to certify quorum.
Oh, I'm sorry. I skipped. Want to do a roll call? Or is a quorum established?
Quorum is established, and we do have Mr. Brown joining us virtually.
Hello, Mr. Brown.
Hello.
Good to see you virtually.
Yeah.
There was a motion to approve the Finance Committee agenda. It's been seconded. All in favor? Say aye.
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 As the ayes have it, the agenda is approved. Next on our agenda is to approve the August 27th CVTA Finance Committee meeting minutes. You should have those minutes before you. Approve the minutes.
Motion approved.
Second.
So the motion and it's been seconded. All in favor of the approval of the August 27th CVTA Finance Committee minutes, say aye.
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 Any noes? Aye as well.
It was a very short meeting.
It was a very it's one of the fastest meetings I've been a part of. The minutes from August 27th are approved. Next on the agenda is the CVTA Finance Committee Chairman's Report. The CVA, the members of the CVTA Finance Committee are Mr. Kevin Carroll from Chesterfield County, Mr. Canova Peterson from Hanover County, Mr. Frank Thornton from Henrico County, and the chair of the CVTA, and Mr. Carlos Brown, also from Henrico County, representing the Commonwealth Transportation Board. And also me, from representing the city of Richmond,
You're the chair.
the chair of the committee.
We weren't gonna let you forget yourself.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's the extent of my report for today. And so, seeing none, we'll move on to the staff report. I'll hand it off to Mr. Carson.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I just wanted to bring your attention to pages 4 and 5 of the agenda packet. It's a letter from Ms. Laura Farmer, who is actually with us in the room, along with Commissioner Britt. And this is an update to the projected revenue from the various taxes that feed into the CVTA fund. If you look at page 5, there are basically 3 different groupings of tables. The first table is an estimate from the actual 2020 General Assembly session. With the third column in that side shows what the revenues will be from fiscal year 21 through 26. And then the middle table is the interim forecast, which was just completed in August of 2020, showing the adjusted expected revenues from 21 to 26. And then the final, the third grouping shows the change from expectations to what we're predicting today. And you can see that in the first two fiscal years, 21 and 22, revenues go down, but starting in 23, they're actually projected to increase from what was last seen in March during the session. So this is information for your consumption. We are working with VDOT to assess the best methods for projecting or at least reporting what the local share of these revenues will be. And we hope to report back to you and as well as the technical committee on what our recommendations are for that in the coming weeks. We do know that at this point, there is a slight delay in receiving the revenues because we have some other business to take care of, like establishing banking accounts and those kinds of things. So once that business is taken care of, we will be able to move forward and start to accrue some of those revenues that were either started July 1 or will start October 1. And with that, unless there's any questions, I'd turn it over to Eric Gregory to talk about the general mission and charge of this committee.
Thank you, Chip. With the chairman's permission, I'll go into a brief PowerPoint just to run over again the basic mission and charge of the CVTA as a whole, most of which you all have heard, but just doesn't hurt to remind at least the public, and also the specific charge given to this committee, the Finance Committee. So let's see, just to review 33.2, 3701 through 3713 is the CVTA Act. It sets up the Central Virginia Transportation Fund, which will be filled by the revenues just mentioned by Chet. And then the authority itself is created by 3702 and governed by the following portions of the code. You all are familiar with that. If you have any questions about that or any portion of the act, please let me know. So next slide, thank you. Legislation creating the authority and the fund were made certain amendments to the state tax laws that were outside of the CVTA Act itself, but provide for those revenues that Chet described. And the monies deposited shall be used for transportation purposes benefiting Planning District 15 and the member jurisdictions and the administrative and operating costs of the authority itself. After administrative and operating expenses, revenues shall be allocated to transportation projects consistent with the legislation. Department of Motor Vehicles, subtracts administrative costs prior to making deposits into the fund. So that's just a minor off the top cut that they take for administrative and operating costs, but it's expected to be minor. And that's provided for in the respective code
Excuse
section.
me, Mr. Gregory.
Yes, sir.
Before we go, could we change the screen so that those that are joining us virtually or horizontal so we can see the full?
Let's see if we can do that.
Mr. Peters, you must have some experience with this.
I believe there's ways.
Look, after the last 3 months, we all did.
More experience than I wanted.
Okay, so while they're working on that, I'll move along. I know the time is valuable. So the fund distribution and oversight, the job of the CVTA essentially is to prioritize and select regional transportation projects to be funded with the 35% of the revenues retained by the CVTA. And all the projects that are funded by that 35% must benefit Planning District 15 member jurisdictions. And to oversee the 50% of funding returned proportionally to each Planning District 15 locality to be used to improve mobility, which may include construction, maintenance, or expansion of roads, sidewalks, trails, mobility services, or transit located in the respective locality. And then also the authority will approve GRTC annual plan for projects funded by the 15% that it receives of fund revenues for transit and mobility services and projects. Also, importantly, the CVTA can issue bonds and finance debt via future tax revenues to be received. So that's something to consider going forward. Now, an important note is to remember that tax revenues are subject to appropriation to the fund by the General Assembly via the state budget process, as you all are aware. The governance documents include the legislation itself, of course, the bylaws, which were approved at the first meeting on August 27th, the guidance documents, which were also approved at that meeting, Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised, and the mission and charge that you all received for this committee. Now, the Finance Committee is responsible under the bylaws for advising the authority on all financial matters and overseeing financial activities undertaken by the authority, including reviewing, commenting on, and recommending the annual budget and adjustments to the budget, reviewing annual revenue estimates, recommending the authority's financial policies and making recommendations on those policies, monitoring the authority's compliance with fiscal policies and procedures, reviewing GRTC's or its successors' expenditure of funds received through the authority on a quarterly basis, reviewing each locality's expenditure of funds received through the authority on a quarterly basis to make sure they are compliant with the code, reviewing financial statements, and working with the auditor of public accounts or its legally authorized representatives in performing the annual audit of financial accounts of the authority. Now, the full authority board, if you recall, on August 27th, directed or requested the Finance Committee for this meeting to review and recommend, and going forward, to review and recommend a draft FY21 operating budget for authority approval, to initiate a request for proposals for certain services required by the authority, that is banking, insurance, and financial services, for example, and also to review and recommend a draft agreement for revenue transfers with the Department of Transportation, which you have in your packet, and also to review the support MOU with Plan RVA and recommend that to the full body if you are so disposed. The CVTA, just to remind everyone, the CVTA, Finance Committee, and all of its other committees and subcommittees are public bodies for purposes of the Freedom of Information Act, so please keep that in mind going forward, and also subject to the State and Local Government Conflict of Interest Act and all other acts and laws applicable to public bodies. So if you have any questions about any of that, please let me know.
Could you back up about 3 slides there?
Yes, sir.
Before you started got into the finance part.
Yes, sir.
Let's go back another time. There's somewhere in there that the legislature can choose just not to give us the money that we've done this. Is that, I think there was.
Yeah, the subject to appropriation note that I mentioned. Yeah, that's true. Under the Constitution of Virginia, Article 10, Section 7, all revenues that the Commonwealth receives are subject to appropriation. So that's true for every department,
So
every program.
Every year.
They have to reappropriate every year pursuant to the every biennium pursuant to the annual budgetary process and biennial budgetary process. So that's in the Constitution, and that's not to cause any concern, but just to make sure everybody is aware. We do not expect, under the draft VDOT revenue transfer agreement, we don't expect that to ever occur, a problem with that to ever occur, but just to be aware, it is a possibility. It's something to keep in the back of your mind. The Commonwealth has always been good on its commitments, and we don't expect that to change, but it's always good to remember that the revenues are subject to appropriation.
Mr. Gregory, I'm smiling behind my mask. And I like the line.
Yeah, you always got to remember. But yeah, it's a reality that we have to be sensitive to. But you know, we have confidence
Now,
as well.
So the funds that are received by the CVTA though are going to be first transferred to VDOT and then to us. Is that what we're saying?
Essentially, yes, but that will be a pass through. The revenues will go to VDOT and then directly into the fund accordingly, pursuant to the agreement, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But it's not as if those funds will be held. They're required by law to be directed into the fund immediately, and so the VDOT step along the way is a pass-through. And VDOT is not taking any off the top.
Any further questions for Mr. Gregory?
Has VDOT created, the memorandum that you have included in the packet today, does that, if established with VDOT, does that create or authorize them to create an account for the money to go in, or they already authorized and created an account? Because my understanding is the revenues will start being collected on October 1st. So have they already established an account in order for the revenues to go to, or how's that work?
VDOT is here today. I'm not an expert on their internal accounting procedures, but I believe the revenues are flowing in. They're being held essentially in trust. And as soon as the accounts are set up for the CVTA, those funds will be fairly immediately released and distributed to those accounts for the CVTA's usage. In the meantime, under the agreement, if approved, the CVTA can requisition payments. So if payments need to be made for services or materials or vendors for whatever reason, before the VDOT, before those funds are received, before the accounts are set up, CVTA can requisition payments that VDOT would make on its behalf. But I would encourage the CVTA to go ahead and get this agreement finalized deliberately. But you know, the longer you wait, the longer those monies are just sitting there. So I would advise the CVTA and the Finance Committee to move forward deliberately with that agreement and get that in place as soon as possible. Because the sooner you do that, the sooner those revenues are going to start flowing smoothly. So does that answer your question, or I'll defer to VDOT to address anything further.
Mr. Chairman, Steve Rich, Commissioner of Highways. I've got Laura Farmer, the Chief Financial Officer, that could go into the mechanisms associated with the appropriation of funds. One, the collection of the taxes, the placement of those funds into the fund, those taxes into the fund, and then the appropriation. So, or if you could walk through, I think it'd be beneficial to be able to walk you through those mechanisms.
Sure. Good morning. Again, my name is Laura Farmer from VDOT. When the legislation was passed, we moved quickly to get the fund set up with the Commonwealth of Virginia. And so with DMV and Department of Taxation will collect fuel and retail sales taxes, they will be reflected as revenue posted with Virginia Department of Transportation. And then in the subsequent accounting period, once the agreement is set up, we will then pay to CVTA what has been collected in the previous accounting period. And so with, I believe, fuel taxes starting in July, we expect receipts to show up this month, later this month. And then retail in October, we expect deposits in November. And so it's a subsequent accounting period. With fuel taxes, there's a 2-month lag between the relationship with the distributor and when the revenue is collected by the state for the taxes, and retail is a subsequent 30-day period. But all the mechanisms have been set up and they're isolated from any other VDOT accounting. They do not flow through the Commonwealth Transportation Fund or anything else. We have these existing relationships with Northern Virginia Transportation Authority and Hampton Roads already. They've been very successful over the last 5 to 6 years.
Thank you.
And I will, just to jump off that point from Ms. Farmer, I will note that Plan RVA staff and the CVTA staff have been working closely with Northern Virginia Transportation Authority and the HR TAC to understand how all that works, and have been looking at their foundational documents and their agreements with VDOT that are very similar to the one before you today. Not exactly the same, but very similar. And so those relationships have been in place for years and have been working successfully.
Any further questions for Mr. Gregory?
Thank you.
Seeing none, we'll move on to item number 5 of our agenda for this morning. That's the draft fiscal year 2021 operating budget. I'll hand it over to Mr. Parsons for the overview of projected inflows and outflows of the operating budget.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Parsons.
If you have the agenda packet on page 6, it's a 1-page slide. It essentially reviews the process by which the CVTA financial cycle is expected to operate. And we will have this information available on the website for the public and other stakeholders to review.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, this is Carlos. On my Zoom screen, I'm not seeing what you're seeing. I have the package, but I don't know if the others who are viewing virtually can see what we're looking at. Okay, now it's up. Yeah, but I haven't been able to see anything prior to this point.
All we were seeing was, we were just seeing your face, Mr. Brown. That's what.
Okay, great. I hope it's large.
Thank you very much. Yes, and now the slides are on the screen for those following at home. I wanted to just quickly go from left to right through the process, and this should mirror what Ms. Farmer mentioned just now in terms of the expected process. So there are tax revenues, sales and use tax, October 2020 and July 2020 in that order, that are received by VDOT from the various sources, fuel vendors, et cetera. And those would be distributed through the agreement to CVTA. And there will be a reporting process and those kinds of things that are outlined more in the agreement. Then our expectation is that operational expenses will be deducted, encompassing some of the things that are listed below that item, like banking, insurance, if there are authority member reimbursements, meeting expenses, the kinds of things that the authority itself would incur. We would then establish the distribution schedule once all of the agreements and processes are in place and adopted. There would be regular fund distributions among the three different pots: the 50% local, the 35% regional, and then the 15% transit. And our expectation is that the 35% regional probably would include the transit governance report, the regional project prioritization, and the regional transit plan that are outlined in the code. It doesn't have to be that way, but so I think there's some latitude in how the finance committee would recommend the costs of those initial studies would be incurred. And then finally, evaluation. We would hope that this process would be evaluated on a regular cycle by the CVTA and streamlined, updated as needed to best meet the needs of the authority in the region. Any questions? The general process, and as I said, a lot of this, there is some latitude that is inherent in the code, that where the funds come from to support operating expenses, the initial planning work that needs to be done to set all the wheels in motion, and those types of things that are happening kind of in the middle of that chart.
Have we gotten further into the weeds than what we're seeing on this chart? This is very high level.
Yes, sir. Yeah, we're fully in the weeds.
So where are the weeds? In other words, only thing we go on the back page is a proposed budget. We get to that. I guess we're not there yet, but
Yes, sir.
want to see more details than just general summaries.
Absolutely. So the way that the agenda is organized, and thank you for that reminder, item 5, items A through F under item 5, all build to taking into consideration the actual budget, the operating budget. So each of these items tends to lend some support for all of the things that were considered as we develop the budget. So as we move A through F, that's where hopefully we can answer some of the concerns and questions that you might have this morning. This first item was generally intended for public consumption.
Good.
So that anybody can take a look and get a good general idea of how the operating structure of the CVTA works. And then we can get more into the other agreements as we move through the agenda. Mr. Chairman, that's all I have for 5A.
That's all you have for 5A?
Yes, sir.
Let's talk about 5B then.
Yes, so the draft agreement for revenue transfers with the Virginia Department of Transportation. Mr. Gregory and our friends from VDOT in the room started discussing this in a little bit of detail. Mr. Gregory, are there any other fine points that you'd like to discuss?
Right, absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Parsons, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. The draft agreement is on page 7 of your packet. And what this agreement does is give some flesh and bone to the general process which Mr. Parsons just described, right? So this is the agreement between the CVTA and VDOT to provide for the revenue transfers, the reporting mechanisms on those revenues and transfers, the compliance that everybody is required to follow, and then also use and availability of funds, what VDOT will do, what CVTA will do, and provide for even termination or settlement of disputes. This agreement is, as I mentioned earlier, is very similar to agreements that have already been in place for a number of years with the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority and HRTAC, the Hampton Roads Transportation Accountability Commission. And it follows that process, although this is customized for the CVTA. They didn't, of course, just cut and paste. So we've been working with legal counsel for VDOT on this over the past several weeks. We have shared this also in draft form with your respective legal counsel for each of your jurisdictions and given them the opportunity to review it and comment upon it. We did receive some responses on when we shared those agreements, and in addition to this, the CVTA support agreement, which we'll get into later. But we didn't receive a whole lot of critiques on this draft agreement. I will tell you that it's not quite there yet because we're still waiting on the project, the SPA, the project administration document, which will be a sort of a sample document that will guide each specific project that's funded under the CVTA process. We expect to receive that probably today. And also the template for the financial reports from VDOT will also be attached to this as Exhibit A, I believe. And we should be receiving that today as well. So I would like to recommend to you that you recommend to the authority full approval today. Unfortunately, I don't think we're in a position to do that because we don't have every piece of the document in place yet. But I believe it's in good form, subject to further discussions that you might have or that your respective jurisdictions may want to consider. But it's a good agreement. I think it does what it needs to do. Happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Mr. Chair. I'm not ready to move forward with this agreement just yet. I mean, as we can see, that it itself is not fully drafted yet. And we certainly want to make sure when we move forward with this, that we get it right the first time, that we don't have to come back and say, okay, now we have to do it again. My legal counsel is not completely responded back because we were actually having conversations about this up to about 5 o'clock yesterday afternoon. So I think what we could do, as we did with the last meeting, if we needed to, is hold another meeting like this prior to the next meeting, or even at the same date and time before the other meeting starts, and give our respective councils from our jurisdictions time, and respective councils from the other members of this CVTA, to make sure that they get all their input in and considered for us when we make the decision, we make the right decision. And so my position would be for us to defer this until the next meeting to make sure that we can get the language correctly, because there may be something that your legal counsel may have expressed that needs to be in it or not in it, and vice versa. And I just want to err on the side of caution since this is just starting up, and I'd like to get it right the first time if we could.
Motion.
I'll make a motion to defer until our next meeting.
I second that. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to say also, I think at this point in time, it's very significant for us to get off to a good start. We've been working on this a long time, and I think us being careful is in the right mode to take on that. So I think that this will hopefully improve things, the whole area.
So there's a motion on the table to defer to a particular date, Mr. Carroll?
Well, when's the next scheduled meeting of the CVTA? Have we set one?
First week of October.
We have not, we have our technical committee meets early next week. And we need to allow adequate public involvement time between that meeting and the next board meeting. So early October, first couple weeks
Okay.
is right now.
And so is it possible that when we schedule that meeting, we could schedule on the same date, an hour ahead of time, for the finance committee to meet prior to that meeting?
As long as that satisfies the public review. I think that's the sticky widget.
Yeah, and depending on what the finance committee recommends, if there are changes that need to be made to the agreement on the spot based upon your input, we may need a little bit more flexibility.
Flexibility as in time prior to the meeting.
Yes, sir. Yeah, so I might just suggest that you plan to meet maybe, if feasible, the week before or something. I mean, it's not absolutely certain or absolutely necessary that the full authority approve this agreement at the next meeting either. You could take your time with it. I will note, subject to appropriation means subject to appropriation. General Assembly is still in town. They're still looking at the budget, and it's pretty tight. So I don't know what they might do. I'm not trying to, create too much of a sense of urgency, but, there is, you want to get this in place and get the revenues flowing as soon as possible. But I certainly wouldn't encourage you to rush anything either. Like I said earlier, do this deliberately. So if you want more time, it's not as if.
So could we schedule a meeting between the TAC meeting and the next CVTA meeting, full meeting? Where we could come again and meet and hopefully have all this ironed out prior to that?
Sure we
I'm
could.
sure we can do that, if it pleases the committee.
Now, when is the tech meeting, Mr.
The TAC meeting? Yeah, it's on Monday.
You're asking the wrong guy. I don't know either. It's on Monday?
Yes, sir.
Okay. 21st, right? I think it's at 11 or something?
12:30.
12:30.
And I've got a couple of questions just from what I was reading here in the draft though. For instance, we're talking about how the money flows. It goes to VDOT, from VDOT into the CVTA accounts. Does the CVTA then distribute it to the jurisdictions and to the DRTC? Or is
shaking
that
her
all
head
done by
yes.
VDOT?
Yeah.
How is that done in other jurisdictions?
Because the legislation requires that your administrative expenses come off the top, VDOT is not involved in the distribution beyond the authority. So it will come to the authority,
would be.
and then you will take care of it from there.
Yeah, does you indicate there's a month delay, I believe, in getting the receipts from taxes, sales, and what have you, to VDOT? Is there a delay for VDOT getting into the CVTA?
It's the subsequent accounting period, so
Maybe
once,
another month?
yes, sir, it's not, we do it by the middle of the month. We would try to get it to you by the 21st day is what we determined to be the cutoff.
So it'll be a monthly distribution to the
Yes,
CVTA.
Mhm.
Of course, then that raises the question of CVTA's expenses are not necessarily the same every single month either. And how we would be maintaining that on an annual basis versus, I think there's a lot of things that have got to be worked
Sounds
through
like
here.
there's a lot of questions still from some of the jurisdictions, and so.
Well, I think especially if you're talking structurally about how the staff, that's why we'll work that out in the budget and what's budgeted for the year. And so that should flesh that out. But as far as distributions and approval of projects and things, I think we've got time. We've got plenty of time actually to kind of hopefully work that out before we start even considering that.
We do. I did have one other question here that I think that this refers to our ability for issue bonds. I believe that was in, where was that page?
The authority does have the authority to issue bonds and finance
A
projects.
very important part of that to me though is
That's,
if the CVTA is issuing the bonds, obviously bond ratings count. Are we issuing the bonds based on the Commonwealth's ratings, or do we have to establish reserves and what have you to issue it under the CVTA as a separate jurisdiction? Do we know how that works? You know, like, I don't know if that's, if you have anything to do with that with VDOT or not, but the bond ratings can be a very critical thing, and the question is, if we're issuing them ourselves, do we have to include building a reserve into our finances within the authority to be able to get the kind of credit ratings we need for bond?
Well, I certainly think that it's a fantastic question and a relevant question. And I think that when we decide as a body who we are going to contract with on our financial services agreement, the particular authority organization that we decide should be able to give us the right answers on how we need to proceed with that. And so it's just going to take some time before we can get the right answer for that.
This is what I agree. I think there's a lot of things here.
Yep.
Still be worked on.
absolutely.
So there's still a motion on the floor to defer the approval of the agreement. Do we have a date yet?
I don't think we have a date for the next
So
finance
I
committee
think-
meeting yet.
I think we would, the motion would have to be modified to defer it to a date to be determined by Plan RVA staff to meet between the TAC agreement and the TAC meeting and the next meeting of the CVTA.
Mr. Thorne, you second that?
I'll second.
It's been seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
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 All opposed, it will be deferred to a meeting determined by the health plan RVA. Mr. Gregory.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Just to follow up on that, we'll continue to work with the legal counsel for the respective jurisdictions and with VDOT on any changes that may be desired in that agreement, and we'll report back, keeping everybody informed. I've been in regular contact with the jurisdiction's legal counsel, and I'll continue to do that and get their input accordingly. So if anybody has any questions or concerns or particular changes that you would like to see or issues you'd like to be addressed in the agreement, please let me know, or funnel that through your staff or your legal counsel.
Thank you, Mr. Gregory. Mr. Gregory, I did have a question
Yes, sir.
pertaining to the budget. And I did not ask it earlier. And it pertains to the full, the fiscal year 2021 budget and the inflows and the outflows. I guess I see what 98.7 million, but this number is a little bit different than what was presented by VDOT. I think they're in the 2020 session. Can anyone explain that difference?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll defer to Mr. Parsons or Ms. Heater or VDOT, somebody other than me to answer that question, because I don't know.
Chat, would you like me to-
Mr. Parsons? Just a point of clarity, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. Just gonna take Mr. Brown's seat. Mr. Chair, you are, just so I know, you are referring to the figure that's included in the table referenced in the VDOT letter,
Correct.
that 136 million there, as compared to the chart that Mr. Parsons went over that references 98 million.
Correct.
The 98 million was a exorbitantly fictitious, conservative figure that we've been using this last month to develop the framework and the template for the CVTA budget. We were operating on last spring's projections for both revenue sources, and we were working with local staff and assuming a very significant cut due to the current economic conditions. The 98 million is obviously a much more conservative figure than what we actually got this past week from VDOT in the projections. So I would encourage you to suspend reference to the 98 million because it was a fictitious number to begin with. just for purposes of us having something to plug into the spreadsheets that we were using. The figure that has
So a
been provided,
placeholder of a number.
yes, that's right.
That's a better explanation.
I like it.
I like that.
You never want to say the word fictitious.
Apologies.
Particularly these days.
Understood. So in the spring, as you see for fiscal year 21, the net was originally 179 million, and then it's been reduced down to the 136 million. That is the number that we'll be operating with. And Mr. Parsons mentioned the missing piece that we're still awaiting from our partnership with VDOT is to be able to understand what the allocation. As you know, the revenues come in from each jurisdiction, and then the distribution, that 50% back to the jurisdiction, is based on the revenues that come in. And so we need to know what the breakdown of the distribution would be by locality in order to flesh out. I think that's one of the items of the weeds, as you phrased it earlier, that needs to be developed. So we have the big number, but the composition of the local contributions to get to that big number is what relates back to the distribution back out to the localities.
Has anybody from staff looked at, because I know we get, just as an example, our tax check from the state.
Right.
It's on a 2-month delay. Has anybody looked at historically what the jurisdictions' recent 2 months of checks have been? Did we take that into consideration when we did this?
When this, meaning
Yes.
the figures here in the
Yep.
table, these figures come from our partners at the state.
Okay.
So I don't know the variables that they have considered in updating those forecasts, but I
Okay.
would assume it has to do with what they've been seeing to date. I know just by virtue of some communication, Chesterfield County has been monitoring the fiscal year
Like a
21 compared to fiscal year 20 even. And so I think it is beyond the capability of our staff as it's currently comprised to be able to imagine what those distributions might be at the local level. So we are
Perhaps-
relying on our local partners.
Perhaps you could make a request to the local partners to provide you with that information.
Absolutely.
And that would give you a better starting point
Absolutely.
or placeholder.
Mr. Parsons.
Yeah, one other item, Mr. Carroll, we have been in conversation at a high level of detail with both Hampton Roads and Northern Virginia to kind of learn from
Sure.
what they've experienced in the last 7 or 8 years. And we do know that Northern Virginia they do estimates in terms of what the local distribution will be of their 30%, that's their local split. And they're able to compare those with what the actuals are. So we're in conversation with them as well as VDOT to see if we can start to develop some type of a model that would provide us those predictions as well.
I
But
also
remember
think
that the VDOT reporting, the monthly reporting will give us those splits anyway.
I
So
also
we'll
think it's healthy
begin
to do
to-
regional comparison too. We can see if we're doing better than they are, or they're doing better than us, and we can kind of figure out why. Or at
Absolutely.
least try anyway.
Yes.
Ready to move on?
Ready to move on, and thank you for answering my question.
Okay, sure, hopefully. I am responsible for item C under number 5, so I will just orient you first. For those viewing at home and for Mr. Brown, this starts on page 16 of the packet. I will let those in the room know that we got some late input from local government legal counsel, and so you do have a copy on your table that includes those latest updates. So from a substantive perspective, they are not significant, but they do help clarify language and streamline some of the information and the terms in the agreement. We've drafted this after looking at pretty thoroughly the agreement that Hampton Roads Planning District Commission has with the Hampton Roads Transportation Accountability Commission. You might recall, if you followed that in their formation, that the legislation that enabled the Hampton Roads Transportation Accountability Commission actually designated Hampton Roads as the support staff organization from the get-go. So they had, by virtue of that designation in the legislation, some additional responsibilities that were bestowed upon them. So we've taken that into consideration. They also, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, had an interim agreement where they had maybe a 12-month agreement, and then they went back. And they've done maybe 2 to 3 revisions since that original agreement, adding additional scopes of work to it. So We tried to look at the complete of the arrangement that they have now 6 years into their existence, but also recognize that they are much farther along. And some of the things that Hampton Roads Planning District Commission is providing today are potentially not appropriate for where we are in this process right now. So this is a pretty, I would say, basic agreement. We've tried to be intentional in anticipating the things that we know that you need right now, but be clear that we have communicated by virtue of these resolutions that have passed between our respective bodies that we're prepared to provide this support through the end of the fiscal year. We're certainly interested in working with you to determine if that is a longer term arrangement or not. And so we did sort of scope this agreement to be have the option of accumulating services over time, but we really had the first 12 months or so of operation in mind. The agreement, I will note, is structured so that, as has been said before, funding to support staff time with our agency would come from the revenues generated with the Transportation Authority off the top prior to the distribution to the 3 buckets, as I'll call them. We're projecting that this agreement would cover, generally speaking, our staff time expenses, including the wages for staff members that might be working on efforts on your behalf, plus our fringe and indirect rate, with an additional 10% administrative fee. The additional costs that we would be billing through this MOU would be inclusive of the legal counsel. We have a standing retainer agreement with Hefty Wiley Gore, and they have agreed to be able to continue that retainer and extend legal services through there. So we would pass on the additional fee that would be incurred through that arrangement. And we try to also specify in the MOU that any additional costs, and I think Mr. Peterson, you sort of referenced this earlier, while you're working out the arrangement with VDOT and the flow of funds and all of the terms and conditions that exist in that agreement, Plan RVA has been and can continue to cover the expenses incurred by the authority until such time as you are ready to receive an invoice for us. So an invoice could also include other regular operating expenses that once you're up and running, you would presumably pay directly to the vendor, but we can cover those expenses for you until such time as those, similar to the offer that VDOT has made in the agreement with you. To date, those expenses have included the meeting costs in preparing for your August 27th meeting. We did buy, I think, a handful of URLs just to be able to save, so that if and when you're ready to have a web presence, you know, it's about $100. So the expenses have been fairly modest, but we tried to create a mechanism in here that if you direct us to incur those types of expenses on your behalf in the near term, we would be able to do that. That's a bit of an overview. I'm happy to answer questions. I think, again, from a timeline perspective, you know, it's important to get this right. So, you know, we wanted to get a draft in front of you. It has been circulated to your respective legal counsel. And we're certainly open to any suggestions or edits. And if, you know, whatever timeline you'd like to move this forward, but ultimately the committee would recommend action with regard to the MOU to the full authority for approval.
Yeah, Martha, I had a question. And what I see might be missing from this agreement is a lack of the key performance indicators.
Okay.
I always think that's a good idea to add to any understanding. So I think that's something I'd like to see, and also maybe just for transparency purposes, the ability for Plan RVA to report out monthly expenses on, expenses on a monthly basis via report.
Well, that makes sense on behalf of what they're actually doing particularly for us.
I think jurisdictions, I think, could benefit from that.
This is Carlos. One question with regard to the administrative and staffing line item. Is Plan RVA contemplating dedicating FTE to supporting the new authority, or is it supplemental? Is basically splitting time of existing staff resources? What's the thought there?
It's a great question, Mr. Brown. At this point in time, looking at the scope of the current agreement in this fiscal year, we are splitting time, as you said. So utilizing existing staff to be able to support the needs of the authority. If it became apparent to us that we would have an opportunity to have a long-term relationship, I think we would be working very closely with you to identify dedicated staff to support your needs. So I don't want to speak for those folks that also serve on our board of commissioners, but I don't think that it would be wise for us to gear up with dedicated staff for this effort if it's set to expire at the end of the fiscal year.
And I guess if you can remind me of the circumstance with HR TAC and Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, of course, they were birthed in concert with the TPOs, but subsequently developed their own staff, but still kind of coexist, co-locate. Is that the model?
Yes, sir. Currently, Hampton Roads Transportation Accountability Commission have 3 employees. Mr. Page serves as the executive director. They have a finance person that they've just brought on board that is providing a lot of the support to the deals and the bond financing projects that they're doing there that have that particular expertise. And they also have, forgive me, I can't recall if it's a part or a full-time position, but an administrative support, executive board support position as well. HR TAC then contracts with HRPDC to provide the back office, financial administration. HR TAC is an employer. They employ those three employees, but HRPDC administers the payroll, the benefits, the retirement benefits under the personnel policies of HR TAC. So they are different than the employees of HRPDC, but HRPDC by contract administers those human resources services. And they also provide additional support to the HR TAC from a bookkeeping and financial report preparation, I'll say the operating financial management, the project-based financial management is happening on the HR TAC side of things. Originally, when they started, as you alluded, Mr. Brown, the HRPDC did provide the whole of the staff support. The HR TAC took a bit longer to get to the point of formation, and as you are doing now than say we did. They did a lot of that under the auspices of the HRPDC and the HR TPO for a while, and so they had, I would say, a bit more in the way of some of the things that the legislation called for, again, because of that designation to HRPDC, but we're mirroring them, I think, as closely as we can. The Northern Virginia Transportation Authority is a completely different structure, and we would be happy to sort of bring that to you and those models and what we've learned to be the pros and the cons of those models, I think probably at a future meeting as you get down the road, but we're learning a lot about how very differently those two organizations are staffed and structured.
And then last question regarding the TPO's bonding experience. Remind me, does the TPO or does it have bonding? I don't believe it has bonding capacity, does it? Or?
No, sir. As a reminder, the MPOs are essentially a federal construct, so it is not an incorporated entity or a political subdivision. It's a decision-making body, certainly, for purposes of allocation of federal dollars, but it relies wholly on Plan RVA by memorandum to provide the staff support. So it is not its own entity like the CVTA is. It does not hold its own account, it does not have bonding authority, and it does not have employees.
So with regard to any bonding activity, we would, if we were to extend the relationship with Plan RVA, we would need to go external to bring in that expertise financially and of course, obviously legal, but even the administration back end financially would need to be done probably externally.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
In lieu of what she said, and look, I know I'm newer to the staff here, but I have confidence in their abilities. But we don't know if this organization is going to have to hire, for example, an executive director or not, and what our expenses and things are going to look like. And we also don't know, which you pointed out, which I think is correct, as we continue to grow, what their expenses are going to be from this. And what I would say, On line 1 where it says shall automatically renew annually, I think that could be changed to subject to review. And the reason I would want it to come up to be subject to review at the first renewal is so that we can actually have some time under our belt to see what resources we're going to need. And that would allow the CVTA to reevaluate, get more information from Plan RBA as to what they may need to be successful. It would bring it back up. And so instead of this kind of just getting forgot because it's automatically renewed and moving forward, it would come back up for review at the end, and then we can make modifications if necessary. And so I would be in favor of just changing that language to something that would require for a review, at least in the first interim, so that we can evaluate and they can honestly come to us and say, okay, this is where we're at and this is what we need. And that would alleviate us from having to say, okay, well, we have to go through the process, which is further, I think, delineated at the end about terminating the MOU. I just think it would be an easier process for us moving forward, but I'm certainly open to thoughts of anybody else.
A motion?
I'll make the motion to amend that. We need to work on the language, what we want to put in there, but, and then I'll certainly listen to anybody else's thoughts.
Mr. Gregory?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chair, I will note, as you referenced, the agreement does allow for, in paragraph 8 and 9, an amendment process and a termination process. So that's essentially an annual review or a review at any time, and a potential termination clause. So if at any time the authority or Plan RBA wants to make amendments or anything necessitates amendments like adding staff or anything else, you could go through that process, or if you want to terminate it, you can use that process as well.
So what would require that from the CVTA in order to do that? Would it require a vote from the CVTA Finance Committee or CVTA as a whole to initiate that change? And would it have to be a majority vote to do it?
I think for the CVTA to take any action, it has to be subject to approval by a majority vote.
Right, and that's why I think that just as an error on the side of caution, that's why I was asking to have that amended at the front end, at least for the first time. And then moving forward from there, I have no problem with us having to put it to a full vote. But I think that it's just.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
I think we're all acting on good faith that we're doing our best to meet the intention of the authority. But I think your comments are well put. We are, this first year is going to look a lot differently than the future years. And I think we could certainly set in the schedule and by virtue of the text in the MOU, a period in this fiscal year that we will review and start to make action for whether or not we will continue to support you, or there will be additional resources that need to come in to assist with that. I would also say, just from the Plan RBA perspective, it would be helpful to us to engage in those conversations
Probably sooner
at the
than later.
beginning of the budget process, so
Yep.
that we can make our plans
Yep.
from a staff support perspective, and that our commissioners are able to engage in that decision making as well. So I think I would like to say that we would be able to design some language that can allow for that for this first year, and if you choose to engage in future years, the automatic renewal could become more of a standard practice.
I don't have a problem with putting an automatic renewal clause after the
We
first
know.
review period.
Sure.
I don't have any problem with that
Sure.
either. I just think we need to be able to evaluate it at that first period to make sure that we can meet meeting our needs and we can meet your needs.
And I would suggest that maybe that because of your comments about the performance indicators and the reporting mechanism, if we work on language, and we could work even maybe with the TAC members to talk through what that could look like, we could bring this agreement with those inputs, revisions back to you based on this conversation at your next to be scheduled meeting, and you could consider the agreement in whole then.
Yeah, and I will just add, I'm in the camp of, from the school of, I don't think we should have continuous renewal. That's why I asked about the key performance indicators, because I'd like to know, and it's not just because of, Plan RBA, it could be anyone that who we're working with. I just think that we should be, I think we should obviously evaluate who we're working with and whether or not, they're meeting our expectations as well. And so I'll come from the camp of not having a continuous renewal. It may put a little more pressure on us as a committee, as a board, as an authority, but I think that's what the residents and taxpayers should probably expect from us.
Mr. Chairman, the reality is right now, we're just trying to get our feet wet, get this thing off the ground. And we've got between now and the end of March to evaluate how things are going before we have to make a decision whether to continue into the next fiscal year or not. I think you brought some good comments into this. So Mr. Carroll, I would suggest that we defer this as we did the VDOT agreement to the next meeting and have some of these additional items adjusted into that.
I'll withdraw my initial motion.
Okay, I'll make
Mr.
that
Carroll's
motion.
motion has been withdrawn.
I move that we defer the decisions on the memorandum of understanding with our RRPDC until our next meeting.
I'll second it.
There's a motion to defer the decision on the MOU until the next meeting. It's been seconded by Mr. Carroll. All in favor, say aye.
Question on the motion, sir?
Mr. Carroll.
Are we going to, we're deferring it to the CVTA Finance Committee meeting that we have
Yeah,
set up?
matching it with,
CVT Finance Committee meeting.
Just wanted to clarify that. So we had the right meeting.
Thank you for your clarification, Mr. Carroll.
Now subject to addressing the things that we've discussed.
Yep, with the previous motion that was made earlier in the meeting, right? So 2 of these items will be before us.
Right.
There's a motion on the floor, it's been seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Ayes have it.
I will just for transparency and clarity, just remind you, we will continue to provide the support. I mean, I think we're all operating in good faith. Our agency is incurring expenses relative to the work that we're providing to you. So I just want to make sure that we're not functioning in a situation where anyone is surprised.
Are you telling us there will be a bill that will come due?
We would very much like to invoice you at the appropriate time.
We expect that.
You're not giving us late fees, are you?
Yes, sir. I would be remiss if with our finance committee members in the room if I didn't also.
I think we might be good for you.
I hope some money's coming in.
Similarly, we are acting on your behalf, and I think that at this point goes without saying, but I just, in the spirit of caution, we want to make sure that until such time as we are officially designated as your staff, we are in communication with you. So Mr. Chair, you will likely see more communication than you typically do in boards that you chair, just because we are functioning in that good faith, but we are operating without any kind of formal designation. So
We understand it. We appreciate your communication and
We appreciate your patience.
absolutely, that's what our organization is designed to do. So we're happy to fill this role.
as Mr. Chairman said, obviously we endeavor to get this right. And so as we blaze out of the gates, we want to ensure that we dot the i's and cross the t's.
Sure.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, this is Carlos, and in that same vein, I did have this question. Because we are in the early formation stage, and I'm very appreciative of the work that council has done. I think he's done a great job in kind of helping to corral this. But I was curious as to how or where he's getting direction. So, for example, as we are moving forward to negotiate some of these agreements, are you convening the council of the respective jurisdictions collectively, or having been in your position where you have multiple clients, how are you coalescing that? Typically, you would use your chair or your someone or exec director to do that. How are you gleaning the will of the collective body? Because I want to make sure that everyone feels that we're having a very transparent process, and it's not the city's document or the state's document or what have you, but it's a collective product. So I just want that clarification for the record.
Happy to answer that question, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Brown, members of the committee. So there are, I guess I would characterize it as multiple inputs into how these agreements are being drafted and how they're being developed and presented to you. I'm legal counsel to Plan RVA and serving in role as legal counsel for the time being to the CVTA as part of that. And as this has unfolded throughout the spring and summer, we've been getting input from the CVTA working group, which is comprised of staff from all of the jurisdictions and the state agencies that are involved in the authority. So we've been in communications with them all along and getting input about these agreements and the budgetary process and all of those things. In addition to that, we've been working with Plan RVA staff to determine how Plan RVA was going to be supporting the CVTA. Of course, looking at the legislation, trying to determine how that was going to function. We've been in touch with VDOT as well, and also taking direction from the chief administrative officers of each of your respective jurisdictions. So those are the various inputs, and I have been in direct communication with each of your respective legal counsels, as I've mentioned, numerous times over the past several months and the past several weeks in particular about these agreements, but have been entirely transparent with them, have sought their input, have solicited their input on these agreements, and virtually every other decision that we've made. Your respective staffs have had the opportunity to have input on these things. So that's where all of this is coming from. I absolutely want transparency. I want input. I shared all of these things with your lawyers. They provided input. That input was incorporated into these agreements where it was provided. So yeah, there's lots of communication at various different levels between Plan RVA staff, the jurisdictional members, the state agencies, and all of their staff. So that's where that direction is coming from all those multiple things. And so trying to coalesce that into a good product for the Finance Committee and for the full authority to consider. So I hope I'm trying to do the best job we can in pulling all that together. So it's not an easy task, but that's what we're trying to do, and that's what we've done.
Well, I appreciate that. And again, I just wanted that to be, to share with that on the record, because I kind of compare it to trying to plan a birthday party for grandma, right? I mean, you got everybody's interest and input, and it's tough, but I know that you've worked hard on that, and I can see the product of that, but I just wanted everyone to understand what that was and what the expectation was, and so that folks would know that every voice is being incorporated, and that's how we would hope to continue to operate. So thank you for all that.
Absolutely. I want everybody to understand none of this work is being done in a vacuum, and we are constantly in communication almost on a daily basis, certainly on a weekly basis, with all of your respective staffs, your legal staff, state agencies, the Attorney General's office even. So we're doing the best work we can for you.
Certainly sounds like a birthday party for grandma.
We're working on the best cake.
We haven't figured out where to hold it yet.
So,
Thank you.
okay. I think now we are on item D.
Yes, thank you. I will note at the onset of this item, we do have that requested action there, which is the authorization for us to prepare and release requests for proposals for banking and insurance. This is not a requirement, so I want to be clear. We wanted to give you a sample motion if you so choose, but staff is frankly interested in your input first about the process by which we should move forward with these. So I'll take them one at a time in my comments, and you can decide if you want to direct us in a block or separately. We talked earlier, I think everyone recognizes that there is an importance to establishing banking relationships for the authority. We do not take that lightly, and certainly I would imagine that any bank in our community would be very happy to hold these accounts and have the relationship with the CVTA. So, a request for proposals, while not necessary, could be a track that you choose to take just to be able to, again, sort of in the spirit of getting this right the first time around. And so we know that establishing that banking account and the ability to distribute funds and those kinds of things is a priority. So we'd like to get your direction as quickly as possible. We spoke with the folks at Hampton Roads in Northern Virginia, and they both had different advice for us about this. In Hampton Roads, they recommended that we immediately go out with an RFP. They've shared their RFP with us. They did recommend that we establish, both have actually recommended that we establish 2 accounts, one that would serve as your general operating account, another that they referred to as the sweep account. Both are much farther along in their operational functions. And so I think we want to take this sort of, Mr. Peterson, you said it very well earlier, we're an infant in this stage. So, take this kind of as needed. The banking relationships and the flow of funds are, as you can imagine, much more complicated given the stage at which Hampton Roads and Northern Virginia are. And so, I want to be transparent with you about that. In Northern Virginia, they recommended that we ride on an existing banking relationship agreement that is acceptable to the authority. They felt that their advice to us was that establishing that account as soon as possible to be able to receive the funds was critical, and they recommended that we expedite that under the limitations that we have, but expedite that as quickly as possible. So we have 2 examples of how these folks that have lived through this experience would recommend, and they're different, and I think both are acceptable. We've talked with Eric at length about this and believe both are appropriate under the provisions of the law, and so it really would be, I think, your choice. Similarly, the insurance issue is kind of in the same situation. There is no requirement under the Virginia procurement regulations that public bodies must solicit proposals for insurance coverage. I will share with you that Plan RBA receives its coverage, its suite of coverages from the VRSA, the Virginia Risk Sharing Association, I think it's called. Thank you. It used to be BML Insurance. There is another public body insurer that is VACORP that is also well regarded in the space. Either of those would be suitable for purposes, and you could also solicit for in the marketplace, I'll say, for insurance coverage. We think at this point in time, it's urgent in the sense of each of you as authority members should be covered under the agency, under the authority's insurance coverage. And there are some other recommended coverages that I'm sure each of those carriers would suggest given the nature and likely scope over time of the authority. So that's sort of the informational part of that. I would imagine you might want to take this in 2 separate items depending on what the outcome would be, but I think love, if possible, to have a little bit of discussion and Q&A from Chet and Mr. Gregory and I if we can answer questions for you.
So you would issue an RFP for both banking and insurance services?
We could. We certainly could. Our agency just recently went through an RFP process. We were in the commercial marketplace for insurance coverage, and we recently did an RFP and selected VRSA as our carrier. You could do the RFP and go through that similar process. We could leverage, you're not required to do an RFP. Similarly, the banking, we have not, as an agency at Plan RBA, we have not looked at switching our accounts for quite some time. I would confess that if the CVTA chose to do an RFP, Plan RBA may follow suit in the next several months, just because we'd like to see what else is out there for us. But it's at your discretion.
We are interested in the RFP option. Obviously, we would want to review the language. I think the committee should have an opportunity to review the language before the RFP is issued into the marketplace.
I agree with that. I think it's important for us to put it out in that method so that the public will see that we're giving an opportunity for competitive bid for our community, and they'll have an opportunity to weigh in. So I concur with that.
If I may, I might withdraw our requested action, and based on that, if there's consensus, I might say that we could also prepare drafts, circulate that again, sort of in this class process that we have been doing among your local government staff members, and
via email and
and then we could bring the drafts back to you for authorization to release them.
Now, you're going to share that with all jurisdictions?
That has been our practice so far.
That's perfect.
I think that's important. We don't want to pick and choose. particular, this is gonna be a choice account for somebody.
Absolutely.
For us to be picking and choosing, it's gonna be not good for anybody.
So you want to make it official, make a motion to review any RFP language, whether it's the email with the membership of the authority and for both banking and insurance services?
Yes, if I may, perhaps there could be a motion to establish this as an agenda item at a future meeting, with the understanding that the next meeting, given the amount overview that we're requesting from your staff members, we'll pace it as quickly as we can in respect to staff for what you've already put on their to-do list.
Is there a motion?
I'll make that motion.
Nicole said.
Is there a second?
I'll second the motion, but I want to have some discussion on that, because I mean, the banking thing is very relevant. I just want to question, is there an urgency on the insurance side for protection for the CVTA that we need short chain, maybe even just short-term coverage?
I'm looking at Dr. Casey.
I think like all these decisions, you want to do it deliberatively. I don't think it's an emergency, like,
Okay.
I think you're okay.
I just
It's,
want to raise that question.
you're a public body, so there are certain sovereign immunities that entail with that. But, you want to get that in place as soon as possible, so I wouldn't dawdle on that. But we'll work our hardest to
Yeah.
get a draft for you and your staffs to review and bring it back, hopefully at the next finance committee meeting for you all to consider that and try to get it out the door as quickly as possible.
Very good.
Thank you.
So there's been a motion and it's been seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Mr. Brown?
Aye.
The ayes have it. Item E,
Thank you. This is my last item for you. So as you may have noticed, we are slowly working ourselves down. If you've taken a look at the draft operating budget, we are slowly working our way through the expense categories. So this is an item that is an attempt to sort of sweep some of the categories that we haven't yet talked about, with hopes that by the time we get to item F, each of those areas will have been somewhat familiar, and then we can talk about the budget as a whole. There's been some talk today and prior to today about what I would characterize as the realities of what we don't know yet about your staffing needs. And so I did want to call attention that in the draft operating budget, you have some line items that would provide for recruitment services, should that be something that you chose to undertake. As a reminder, I do not believe that setting a budget for something is binding or obligating you to those expenditures, but it would enable you to move forward in that direction if that's something that you decided. So I know that has been, a question among many folks' minds, and so we did incorporate a line item that could allow for that type of expenditure if that's the direction you want to go. I will say from my own organization's experience, the HR roundtable from the region was very helpful in recruiting a number of key regional body positions in the region. So that would, I think, also be on the table. This would just give you the flexibility to support that process if and when you decide to move forward this fiscal year with it. Similarly, we did also include in the budget line items funding that is based on the costs that we've incurred at your very first meeting. At this point in time, we haven't established a regular schedule for the CVTA or its committees. You will be undertaking that as a full body at your next meeting. I think it's likely to expect that you will have a higher level of meetings during the first part of this process, and then may go to fewer meetings more regularly. The code, if I'm not mistaken, does require at minimum that the full authority meet quarterly. So we know that. And so we did put some estimations in as far as meeting expenses. We also do not know whether the preference of the authority members will be to convene in person or to convene virtually, which obviously has a significant impact on cost and location choice and those types of things. As you can see, I think a meeting in this space of this size works well. When we get the full authority of 16 people, it might be a little bit harder for us to host here. So we are interested in working with the localities on alternative locations that would be both affordable but would meet your needs as well as the public open meetings. So we have put funding in the budget for that as well, again, with a lot of uncertainty as to what your direction might be on that subject. Similarly, we know that there's a lot of enthusiasm in the region with regard to public access to the decisions that you are making and informing this authority and operating going forward. We've put a small amount of money after looking at what HR TAC and NVTA budget and thinking realistically about what might be likely to undertake this fiscal year with regard to public outreach, things like a web presence, that kind of thing. I think in the short term, we've been using our Plan RVA website. We purchased the URLs. We can link those to our site so that public accessibility is there. Certainly at some point in time, you may decide to have your own website, which will have costs. So we've accounted for that. And then finally, the code does provide for the authority to set compensation and expense reimbursements to authority members for participating. We've pulled the guidelines actually from the Commonwealth Transportation Board with regard to how they do member compensation. So there are funds set aside in the budget here. Again, we know that that's not a decision that you've made yet, but we tried to sort of anticipate those additional expenses that may be on your agenda in future meetings to decide. So I wanted to just be able to cover those. I think I'm happy to answer any questions, or I think Mr. Parsons would on those items, but those were sort of the handful of items that we haven't already previously covered that are components of the budget. And I will last note, we didn't list this, but there is a zero cost in the budget for audit, and that is because you are in your first year. Your audit expenses for fiscal year 21 would not be incurred until next fiscal year. The range of what audit costs look like for the existing authorities is quite broad. And I think, again, we're trying to ground that in what your actual financial activity will be this coming fiscal year. So I would expect it wouldn't be more than $10,000 next fiscal year, despite the hundreds of thousands of dollars that this HR Tech pays. But that's, relative to their financial activity. Those are I'll stop there.
Any questions?
Well, certainly this is a good overview, but and there certainly are estimates. I would hope that in the future we can have more information relating to these costs on line items. As an example, the second most expensive item here is $44,000 for meeting expenses, which includes meals, AV, and I think probably that you probably have some baseline on that, on depending on what Plan RVA has paid in the past for AV rentals, for meeting rooms, those kind of things. So I would hope that we could have a little bit more, and I know we do it in other budget presentations where there's more detail. So I would hope to have that as we move forward.
Understood. Absolutely. We based that 44,000 on the 12,000 cost of the August 27th meeting. That was, of course, inclusive of, security and on-site EMT, the space rental at the convention center and the AV costs and the meal. I don't know whether the feedback, frankly, we've gotten from TAC members is that that's likely not to be
I would hope not.
That
would
norm?
cost us that much every time we have a meeting.
Correct.
I think we need to find a more economical way to do it.
Cedar, the quick question on which line item here speaks to the a potential executive director search. Would that be the recruitment line item?
Yes.
15?
Yes.
Gotcha.
Mr. Chairman, indulgence. I didn't hear you say a whole lot about the executive director search. Did you mention that?
Simply, I breezed over it. Simply that at this point in time, we do not know your intentions or timeline. So
Okay.
from a budget perspective, we have put $15,000 as a, I'll say placeholder for that line item of recruitment. That may or may not be a number appropriate depending on your strategy, but we recognize that that probably is a conversation you will have in greater detail down the road. And it, I don't know that today is the day to have it, but we know that that's been a question. And so we wanted to account for at least something in the budget for that activity.
Again, Mr. Chairman, the reason I just brought that up is simply that here again, for transparency and not rushing, have more time, I think that maybe the full committee need to take a look at that also in certain aspects.
Take a look at what, Mr. Thornton?
The executive director search thing.
I mean, I think we're in an interesting situation where we work to establish a budget for activities that are yet to be defined. And so I think you could decide to approach this in multiple ways. You could include a budget you could recommend a budget to the authority that includes these items as placeholders to be decided later. You could also go through a budget amendment process once you've made these decisions. I think either are fine. To your point, Mr. Carroll, getting feedback about the form and level of detail to describe the items is helpful and very important. I will note that the authority is subject to a public hearing process for final adoption of the budget. So from a procedural perspective, the committee would, once it is satisfied with the draft budget, make recommendation to the full authority, and the authority could either review the budget, probably similar to your local processes, and then schedule the public hearing, or you could contract that process. It would be, again, at your direction to us. But it's likely that the budget process itself could be a 2 to 3 month process, depending on how many meetings you want to have to review the items.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, Ms. Heater, I think for staff, we were sort of trying to figure out, okay, how would this public hearing process unfold? When would we schedule that? We were looking as far out as December for that public hearing. There's no time period or specific timeline for that in the code for your budget process, but you do have to have the public hearing. So we were thinking, a couple of meetings down the road, but that's at the direction of the Finance Committee and the authority.
Ms. Heater, I had a question just for some clarification, looking at item 4 of the agreement on page 2 of 4. And looking at in item 4, the letter D, does the budget cover the cost for this transit governance and prioritization costs?
Excellent.
Particularly the December deadline looming?
Excellent question. The budget does not. I think another item that the TAC, if I'm not mistaken, on Monday will begin to discuss is how they would recommend to the authority proceeding with those 2 items, the regional prioritization and the regional transit plan and the governance requirement. There is a potential that the CVTA would accept, I'm not going out of my depth very quickly here, but would accept the prioritization process from the Richmond Regional Transportation Planning Organization. Therefore, in that scenario, there may not be a lot that there needs a lot of work to do, so to speak, on behalf of the CVTA if those 2 processes are married, if I can say it that way.
Yeah, I think our hope, and I think Mr. Carroll kind of hit on this earlier, is that a lot of the shared services that Plan RVA will be providing in terms of split staff, as Mr. Brown asked earlier, would be to be able to provide some background focus on these work tasks without having to incur additional expenses, because we're so aligned in terms of the mission of what the TPO and Plan RVA do in regards to the work tasks that are outlined in the code. Mr. Chairman, I think item 5 kind of hits on the ability of Plan RBA to provide additional services. And I think the intent there, if I'm correct, Mr. Gregory, was this to show that we could provide additional support outside of the compliance and the oversight to actually do some of the work among our staff to help move those things along. The other thing that the TAC is going to consider is possibly development of an RFP for consultant assistance in some of those items, depending on the time frame and the urgency. So I think there could be a combination of where those support services come from.
Any questions, further questions? Seeing none. So we'll move on. Peterson, looking intently at those papers.
Mr. Carroll was, nice 50,000 foot overview, but with not enough knowledge to know whether it's right or not. And I have to say, Ms. Cedar and your staff, you don't know what we want to do either, as you pull it down, so.
Honestly, this conversation has been incredibly helpful to us. I mean, we've batted around a number of I wonder what scenarios, and so your guidance today has been very helpful. I would again echo Mr. Gregory's comments. We did on the agenda include an action item for a recommendation of the, moving the budget forward in the process. I don't think that that's a necessity, and your feedback has been incredibly helpful.
What we could say is we could defer this to our next scheduled CVTA meeting with the other deferred items, and perhaps have a more detailed document for us to review at the next meeting that would be more comprehensive, that we could make a recommendation at that point to move forward to the full CVTA.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would imagine that TAC members after their meeting on Monday will also have, some.
They may have some recommendations and
Yes.
help with that as well.
Yeah, this today, it may not feel like it's been action-packed, but it's been very helpful to us. And, while it is your second technical meeting, it is the, first time we've really been able to interact with you to know what direction we should take on a number of these items. And this has been tremendously helpful.
Well, I think we all figured that we would be working out the kinks as much as we can in this public setting. Obviously, we know our staff's been working diligently behind the scenes to get it right as well, but obviously as the elected officials, we have to ensure that we are getting the best product for the people that we represent. So this has been very, very, very helpful. So,
Mr. Chair, if you would please, I would make a motion for us to defer this to the next scheduled CVTA Finance Committee meeting, at which time they can come forward with a more detailed proposal for us to consider to forward to the full CVTA.
I'll second that.
there's a motion on the floor. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
But thank you very much for the preliminary work, and we look forward to a more comprehensive report.
Thank you, Ms. Hughes. Mr. Parsons, I hear you are going to handle item F.
I think we're there already.
We are done, okay.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Mr. Carroll's motion just, I think it took care of item F, so that we're going to consider it the next finance committee meeting, so we can move on.
All right, we have, let's move on to item 6, public comment period. Is there anyone from the public who wishes to address the committee?
I will report that we did post this in advance and did not receive, one of the methods for public comment was submitting email comments in advance. We did not receive any as of 5 o'clock yesterday evening. So that's the report on the advanced comment side.
Okay. So no public comments? Seeing none, we'll move on to item 7, future meeting topics and schedule. Obviously, we have more topics added to our agenda for next time around, so think my recommendation to my fellow members of the committee is to plan accordingly.
Pack a lunch.
Yeah, pack a lunch. Obviously, we will have to cover the financial advisor services, bond counsel services, fiscal year 2022 budget, and now memorandum of understanding, operating budget items as well that we discussed today too. So looking forward to a thorough a thorough meeting in the future as well. And I guess we should consider schedule. Do we have a scheduled meeting on the books?
We don't.
We do not.
We-
Well, our teams obviously work behind the scenes to. That sounds
Yes,
good.
we've been working with your respective offices if you have support for scheduling to identify dates. We thought that the outcomes of today's meeting might happen as they have, which is why we have not scheduled the next authority meeting so that we could space those appropriately. So we will be in touch for scheduling the finance committee meeting, and I think we could go ahead at that point in time to know the time band in between to schedule both the finance committee meeting and the full authority meeting so that they're on your calendars, and then we'll be able to move forward on a more regular schedule from there.
That's great.
Works for me. I did have a question about the, I guess you could say, today we are here in person. We do have one member who is meeting virtually. I know each locality has their own separate way on how they go about their public meetings. In the city of Richmond, we have not had any public in-person meetings. We've done everything virtually. I do know that virtual can be a burden on sometimes the process. However, with the virus and the pandemic still amongst us, we've sought to be as careful as possible. Do we want to continue with in-person meetings, or is virtual still a possibility for the entire committee to conduct business?
Mr. Chairman, I'm very comfortable with what we're doing today. I think this is a good approach. We have the option of virtual, but getting together is usually much more effective, particularly with all the things we have to work through. It's much harder to do in a virtual atmosphere.
I agree.
Mr. Carroll?
I agree with Mr. Peterson.
Yeah,
Mr. Thornton?
I agree with the setting we have here and the options.
Mr. Brown?
Well, I'll just say, with all the boards and committees that I'm on, I know that each of you each have lengthy commitments. This is the only body that I'm participating in that's actually having in-person meetings. At Dominion, we don't even have our board meetings in person, even with a very limited non-public access component. So I think that it creates a little bit of a challenge to have a hybrid model because it quite frankly creates pressure to attend in person, even if you're not comfortable, because you don't want to be excluded or miss something. But I think my position is that we ought not be having public in-person meetings as long as we're still kind of operating generally under kind of a state of emergency around trying to manage the virus. I mean, again, we have way more than 10 people in that room, and the room is, it's a larger room. I've been there before, but I've heard coughing and other issues. And so I just, quite frankly, would discourage it, or we need to move to a larger venue where we truly can have more significant social distancing. So that's just my 2 cents. I know it's one perspective. This Zoom platform obviously is performing much better than the platform we used at the initial meeting of the CVTA. And again, I've participated in, dozens and dozens of meetings through that medium, and it's been productive. So that's just my view. And And quite frankly, I'm probably not going to attend in person until we're in a better situation.
Mr. Parsons, is there any ability to find a larger room that will provide for more appropriate social distancing for a meeting of this capacity?
Yes, we will certainly do our best. I mean, I think we'll work with our member governments to see if there's space available. I mean, I think at a last resort, we'll incur additional expenses to secure a room, but I think there should be availability. It's just going to take some time to locate that.
I mean, we may have within our organizations a sufficient space that we could use that would not incur an expense. So I think that we
We
certainly
do,
should
but
look.
when I look around this room today, we are socially distanced throughout the room, so I'm not seeing where the problem is today. If we had a large influx of more public coming to this meeting, yes, it would be an issue.
Yes, and it would actually limit our ability to let them in if they actually wanted to
Yes.
come. So I do think it's important to have, if we're going to do that, have a larger venue. But on the other hand, the public, the question is also, would they have the ability to dial in and ask questions to the meeting? So if we kept both options available and the public did not want to come to the meeting physically, would they have the ability to let into the meeting at the public comment time?
We've been doing that in Hanover County for some time. We have our meetings in the boardroom, but we also have virtual aspect of it as well. And we limit the number of people that can come to the boardroom. But we're also allowing people through email and voicemail to send comments and all that are read into the meetings as well. So we really work, and it's been working pretty well.
I say, Mr. Parsons, if we can find a larger venue, obviously, as Mr. Peterson stated at the top, it is always better if we can be in person to conduct this business, which will also be inclusive of Mr. Brown as well. Mr. Brown attended the first Finance Committee meeting in a larger space. And if we can find that space to conduct business moving forward, I think that would be most appropriate for the committee.
Absolutely, we'll look into it.
There goes that line item.
Well, no, Mr. Carroll, you said if there's a way that we
Yep.
can find, there's always a middle ground on these things, you know that, right?
That's right. That's right.
I think Ms. Heater had already anticipated that, what she had for the meetings.
Any comments from the members?
Mr. Chairman, I would like to comment, and I would like to thank Carlos Brown. Because ever since I first met him on the CTV, he has been a champion for the formation of the Transportation Authority here in Central Virginia. And I know there was some early resistance, but he's been persistent with it, and now we have the authority in place. And he deserves a lot of credit for his pushing forward to us to get to this point where we can be competitive with the rest of the Commonwealth. So I think we're sitting here working through the weeds a little bit today, but I think we have to sit here with a lot of anticipation to the great opportunities we have in front of us now to really improve the infrastructure throughout our region and really make this a much better place. All of our jurisdictions have been investing very much into transportation at this point to the extent we have. I anticipate everybody will continue to do that, and that the funds we bring in here will be additive so that we're not hurting anything we're already doing, but we're adding to it to make this a much better region all around. And the cooperation that I anticipate we're going to have, I thought it's just an exciting future we have for us.
Mr. Peters and I second your comments, and it's always good when the region can get together and focus on the infrastructure, which will allow us to be even more competitive as a region. I know we've spoken about Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads on a few moments today, but I'm a very, very competitive person. I want this region to be the most competitive region in the Commonwealth of Virginia, so we can continue to attract employers and the talent necessary to take the region and our localities to the next level. So I do commend Mr. Brown, but also commend the work of the members who are at this table and the member jurisdictions as well, coming together on a large undertaking that I think will serve us well and serve the people we serve well over the course of the next decades. So I second those comments.
Mr. Chairman, if you allow me, I'd like to say too that I'm happy to be a part of this auspicious group here. And many of you know that we've been working on this, as I referred to our first meeting, the new baby. CVTA worked hard on this. And as the chairman said, you know, we are a competitive area. And the whole thing is about really collegiality as far as we're concerned, and also being the very best. And because people want to come to the best region. And so that's what we got to keep our eyes on. And that's why we have to make sure that we do this right, get it going in the right direction, so that this district, this region will soar. Because there's so many people who are part of it, who are no longer around today. We must make sure we continue to make this, I call it spaceship, go in the right direction. And I think we are. I also want to give credit to Ms. Heater and also Mr. Gregory and Mr. Parson, all the hard work that you do. That's very important, and we are appreciative of it. So thank you so very much.
Thank you, Mr. Thornton.
All I can say is I echo the sentiments of all of you. I also want to thank you, Mr. Chair, for conducting the meeting today. I thought this meeting has moved along very well. It was very well organized. Staff for putting the agenda together. And I do look forward. I think this is a tremendous opportunity for the region to put together a future for us. And I think that so far so good. I think it's a great start. And I hope that, 10 years down the road, when people look back on us, they go, boy, you know what? They got it right. They did it what we needed for us. And I know that's what everybody's in their heart. That's what they want to do. And so, again, I commend everybody for their comments and the work today. I thought it was very productive.
I appreciate those comments, Mr. Carroll, as the only member who has no meeting responsibilities in the region. I don't get to conduct the meetings like you all do, so I appreciate those comments.
Well, Mr. Chair, I just want to say I want to thank Mr. Peterson for his comments, and also I think it's very important to acknowledge the administrators, Mr. Patokis, Mr. Casey, you as the leader of the city, and all the other chief executives of the region. At the end of the day, as we say in my religious tradition, the preacher preaches, but the Holy Spirit saves. And ultimately here, it required vision on the part of these leaders to overcome, sometimes the distrust and the issues of the past, to believe that we could get here today. I think, I talked to some of our colleagues after the last meeting, the CVTA meeting. And the reality is, for as interesting as that meeting was, it took Hampton Roads and Northern Virginia several meetings to accomplish what we did in one. Now, part of that's because we had some other models, but part of that's because I think this region truly was ready to come together. And so I'm thrilled, excited. I also do think that the work that Mr. Parsons has done, and Martha and our council, they've done really, really good work to get us and position us to be here today. And they have demonstrated that transparency, which is very important when you're, as Mr. Thornton says, birthing a new baby. So thank you all. I'm thrilled to be here at this point, thrilled to see what's to come for the region, and excited. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this meeting and for accommodating me virtually.
Thank you, Mr. Brown.
So we're closer to getting grandma's birthday. Sorry, Mr. Brown, that was a great joke. I had to use it.
Well, that's that. I try to make things simple. That's how.
Planning still in process. Planning still in process. All right, seeing no more on our agenda, is there a motion to adjourn?
Motion made.
Motion made. All seconded. Motion carried. We're adjourned.
See you next time.